To create the quilted lattice crochet stitch look, it is worked in multiples of 6 plus 1. I've chained 20 for our first row. I did 18 to get the multiples of 6, 19 for our plus 1, and then one more for our turning chain, which does not count as a stitch. Now to work into the second stitch from the hook for our very first slip stitch, we will be working in the back loops only. This entire pattern will be worked in the back loops only using slip stitches. Now before we get started with our very first stitch, we are going to already bring in our secondary color and lay it across our work. The reason being is we want to catch it right off the bat into this first slip stitch. So what we will do is we'll lay it across the front, insert our hook into that very first stitch, yarn over, and complete that slip stitch. If you notice, we've caught our yarn in there. Now this first the secondary color can slide around, but the main point is we want it to be able to sit where it's at, and we're just catching that. Then we will slip stitch into the next 5. Keeping your slip stitches loose, we want to be able to work easily into them on the next rows. Now for the next stitch, we want to once again catch our secondary color. So simply lay it across your work, working around it, and completing that slip stitch while catching that secondary color. We'll repeat that again where we slip stitch 5, and then we will work our next stitch by catching that secondary color, laying it across the front, working around it, and completing that slip stitch. You'll notice that we don't want it to pull too tight. Sometimes I'll give my fabric a little tug. As long as it can be played with a little bit, that's what we want. And now for our very last repeat of this row, we once again slip stitch 5, and in that very last stitch, once again, we will catch that secondary color by working a slip stitch around it. It'll get a little bit easier the more fabric we get, but this is the completion of row 1. Now for row 2 and row 3, we are going to chain 1 and turn, and then we will be working in the back loops only, slip stitching across for both rows 2 and 3. You can simply ignore that secondary color on the front and slip stitch across for rows 2 and 3 in the back loops only. For row 4, we are actually working a wrong side row where the wrong side is facing us, but our yarn will continue to be carried on this other side, which is the right side of the work. But it will be carried on, we'll be looking at the wrong side of the row and carrying on the back. But you'll kind of flip back and forth so you can see what you're doing. So for the very first back loop slip stitch of this row, you will also want to bring that secondary color up and catch it in that very first slip stitch. Now you're going to let it sit on the front and work 2 more slip stitches. And so for the next 4th stitch in the row, we will insert our hook. And this is where we're going to not only catch the yarn we're carrying, but also the one from the rows below. Yarn over and complete that slip stitch. Now what this just did is it pulled that yarn from our very first row up. And this is what will create that beautiful design by catching that one as well as the one that we're carrying across. Now we will slip stitch into the next 5 while also letting that yarn on the front just sit unworked. And then once again in this next stitch, we'll insert the back loop only. We'll lay across our yarn, our secondary color that we're carrying, and also go under the carried yarn from the first row. Yarn over, and then complete that slip stitch. insert your hook, lay the yarn across, underneath, complete that stitch. Now when we have 3 stitches left, what we'll do is we will slip stitch 2, and then for that very last one, we will once again catch our yarn. So we'll bring it into here, catch our carried yarn, and complete that slip stitch. And that is the end of row 4. Now for rows 5 and 6, we'll do the same thing we did on 2 and 3, where we're simply going to slip stitch into the back loops only across both of those rows. Here we are on row 7. This is the last row in the repeat, so everything after this will just be repeating what we've done. What we will do is, as we want to enter into our first stitch, we first want to set up our row. We really need to be continuing to carry this yarn across the front, so you kind of just bring it up to the side and prepare for it to be carried. But we also want to first go underneath the yarn from below, then the carried yarn, then into the back loop. This is the trickiest part of it, but it's really not bad. Yarn over and complete that slip stitch. As you can see, it pulled up this line here that we want to see. Now we will slip stitch into the next 5. Slip stitching creates that beautiful background of knit-like stitches. It does take more work, but it's worth the look. Now we're going to do this again, where we will insert our hook underneath the strand from below, our carried yarn, and then into our back loop only, and complete that slip stitch. Repeat again. And then when we get to the very end of the row, we once again want to insert from below and our carried yarn, and then the back loop of that very last stitch. And those edge stitches can be a little bit harder to work into. Just make sure you're finding the right strand to work into. And there we are. As you can see that the yarn on the ends get carried up. They do show a little bit more in the secondary color as they carry up the side. But if you're doing a ribbed edge on either side, or even gathering one side, it's not noticeable once you gather or do a ribbed edge to cover up that carried yarn floating up the side. But the main body of the work does that beautiful quilted lattice stitch. You simply repeat rows 2 through 7, so a 6-row repeat, to continue to get this effect. I went ahead and did one more repeat so that you could see this and how it works up. It's really a lovely pattern, a bit time consuming, but worth it for a hat. I might consider doing it in a blanket with a really chunky yarn. It's just those slip stitches that take a while to create that fabric, but I love this look. As we turn it this way, we can see that the knit stitches look knit, even though they're crochet, and this lattice work across the front flows really nicely and has some very nice, unique lines. I hope you continue to follow along and enjoy me for some more fun stitches and patterns, so be sure to hit that like button. Thank you.